Hey, thanks for tuning into this video. Today, I'm going to do a little bit of a history behind my E30. I've actually just hit 11 years of ownership with this particular E30, and a lot of that did occur before I had this YouTube page. So I just kind of want to go back in time and relive those 11 years of ownership to catch us up to this part. Depending on how you look at it, I could probably break it down into 3 or 4 different phases. And I think I'm really at the next stage of moving into the next phase of this E30. So when I first bought this car, it was a 1987 325e base model, 5-speed transmission, and as stock as you could get it. This was right at the end of 2013. And probably for the first 2 years that I had the car, it was a daily driver as I finished up my undergrad degree. And just because I bought it super stock doesn't mean it stayed that way for very long. The first modification that I really did to this car was add the H&R race springs with the Bilstein Sport struts. Along with that, I picked up a set, I think they were called DR37s or some iteration of that, from Discount Tire Directs to change the wheels into a 16-inch set, and of course had to get new tires with that, but nothing crazy at that point. Really spent this time what I would call phase one of just getting the car with some minor mods to it, kind of making it more my style. Along with what I just mentioned, I also painted the trim to try to black it out, get rid of some of the chrome that was all over the car. In addition to that, I did some minor things like change out the grills to a Euro set of grills, add in the European plate filler on the rear. Can't fully remember the timeline, but around that time I also did the Z3 short throw lever along with the Condor weighted shift knob. Just a lot of minor things to make it more E30 for me. Nothing too crazy happened in this first phase, and it wasn't until probably around almost 2 years of ownership that I really started moving into that second phase that really transformed the car. For what I'm calling phase two, I went ahead and bought a spare. It was the 2.5 liter engine from the 325i's. So already it was going to be an upgrade to the E engine that my car originally came with. But I also decided to drop all the money I had at the time, take that engine up to VAC Motorsports up in Philly when I was living on the East Coast. And they were able to bore the engine out. I think I just did 1 millimeter larger, and I was getting the Carrillo CP pistons that were custom made for this application. They were an 11-to-1 compression ratio, and of course that 1 millimeter oversized. At the same time, I also got the appropriate M52 crankshaft to go in the car. Stayed with the stock 325i rods. I think they were about the 135 millimeter. So at this point I was of course building a 2.9 liter stroker motor for my E30. The top end here was a port and polished head from Bimmer Heads along with a 284 degree cam. I put that engine in, I want to say it was about halfway through 2015. When I did the 2.9 liter engine change, this was just done in the parking lot of the townhouse I was living in at the time. So nothing fancy with that. I borrowed an engine hoist and I had some friends help kind of change this engine out over the course of a few weeks. Luckily, we had really nice weather for that time, so I never really had to hide from the rain or cover things up or be super concerned about poor weather coming through. Also added the long tube headers. It's the long tube headers that were originally from BAV Auto. This goes into a single tube back. It's 2.5 inches back to a vibrant resonator and muffler, and that exhaust system is still on the car. Of course, to run this larger compression, larger displacement engine, I switched everything over to the standalone Mega Squirt. Nothing changed with the transmission at this point, but I did go ahead and put in a lightened flywheel. Because I had the E motor, I was going from the dual mass flywheel, which would have just been too heavy. I didn't want to keep that anymore, and I had to source a single mass flywheel regardless. So I decided to spend the extra little money and get the lighted flywheel from RHD in Australia. That went in fairly straightforward. I did have to get a European, I think it was a 323i throwout bearing just to make up the difference of the E transmission flange, I guess, to the now smaller flywheel. It's a pretty well documented change, so I just kind of had to follow what I was seeing on the internet, and it all went together fairly straightforward. At that point, I had the engine in, it was running. Took a while to get the tune kind of nailed down. I did take it to MA Motorsports in Maryland for some dyno tuning. I want to say the best we were able to do was 192 horsepower to the wheels and about 202 foot-pounds of torque. It always had a little bit of drivability problems. I fought the dreaded 4K stutter that some M20s will have, but moving the crank position sensor a little bit closer to the toothed wheel kind of alleviated some of that problem. Didn't do too much to the fueling system. I think I went to the larger pink top. I want to say they're 21-pound injectors. So I had plenty of fuel for the application, airflow, plenty of air for the application, but everything just kind of didn't fully come together. So I was never able to break that 200 horsepower mark that I was really aiming for. At that point, I had the engine in for about a full year. I got about 20,000 miles on it in that time and did a handful of autocross events. But then it started to develop what I would say was an engine knock. Was never able to really pinpoint where the problem was coming from. Dropped the oil pan, looked at the main bearings, looked at the rod ends, but never really saw a conclusive evidence of where my problem was. Looking back at it now, I'd probably say a lot of this had to go with maybe a fault in the tune, or it just wasn't ironed out well enough, and I was getting a lot of issues coming from that, but I don't know for certain. At that point, that kind of wraps up phase 2. The car sat for a while I had moved away. I had some help swapping a stock 325i 2.5 liter engine into it, and that's about where I would say my phase 3 started for the car. It was kind of a revival at that point. I flew back home to where the car was after that engine swap was complete, and I drove it to 2,000 miles from Maryland out to Montana a day after that engine was done being swapped in. Only one slight error on that time. The battery just wasn't connected well enough, so a few bumps actually shut the car off and I wasn't able to get it started again. Tracked it down to just that loose connection on the battery, and then from there on, no issues at all. So now I had the car in Montana, and I would say that this is where kind of phase 3 really kicked off. I was at grad school at this point in Montana, didn't have a garage. Everything I had done previously was just working in a parking lot. At that same time, I went ahead and put the European metal bumpers on the car. So it's gonna look a lot better at this point. And at this point, I was trying to get a little bit more serious about autocross. I ended up putting some parts on that really classed me out of any competition. So what I did was put the Z3 front steering rack on, and this was the then manual without power steering. So the power steering unit came out. Along with that, I added in the new control arms with the M3 kind of offset bushings that give it just a little bit more caster. Again, did this in the parking lot where I was going to grad school. It just took me a few days at this point. Didn't face any problems from the university. Not happy with me doing this in the parking lot, which was super good. And yeah, at this point, it was just about getting the car drivable, having fun with the car. I took it kind of all throughout Montana to see the mountains and try to do some photogenic photo shoots with the car. I did take the car with me to California for a year while I was there in Berkeley. It was super cool to kind of have the car with me, to move into a new car scene and see more of a year-round car scene where some super nice cars were being driven to all of the meets. And of course, a really good showing of vintage BMWs there. And there, I would say around 2021, I graduated from grad school. I'd moved on, finally picking a place to settle down in Washington. And I would say this is kind of where phase 4 started, and then that's kind of what the car is now. But I got the individual throttle bodies from RHD and went ahead and installed them into the car. I've documented that pretty well. I would say at this point, a lot of what I was doing with the car was making it onto YouTube. Again, with the RHD ITBs, I also went back to having the Mega Squirt running the car. And I was really just trying to, clean up the car and make it a little bit cleaner around the years of neglect that I've kind of just pushed off some of the other maintenance that I might need to have done to the car. Spent a lot of time, I would say earlier this year, doing all new brakes on the car. But one thing I've always said that I would do to this car over the years is tackle the rust that I have. I've pointed out some of the major spots over the years showing the rust on the car, but I've never really had the opportunity to go ahead and cut out metal, weld in new metal, and refurbish the car around the bits of rust that I have. So that's kind of where I'm at now. And what I would say phase 5 is moving forward after 11 years of ownership and probably 11 years of saying I'm gonna do something about the rust. I'm finally gonna start tackling the rust. My plans start with the back end of the car. Of course, because I switched to the European bumpers, there's some extra bolt holes that I no longer use back there. So I think I'm gonna start practicing filling in those holes and then moving from the rear of the car forward, tackling the rust. Gonna have to put in a new battery box. There's a few small sections around the rear tires that I'm gonna have to patch in new metal. And really this will give me a good time to also refurb the fueling system. I wanna say my gas tank is obviously original, but I do think it might have a little bit of rust at the seams. And that's gonna be a piece that I'm gonna wanna change as well. So hopefully over the next few months, I'll start with the rear of the car, work on the rust, work on the fueling system. If I'm lucky, I'll get a new differential in there because it is still the stock E differential, which I think is a 273 or 293. And it just doesn't have that torque that I want now having this 325i engine on the car. So I'll start with the rear, move through the car. I do know I have a bit of rust where the footwell is up in the front of the car, so I know I'm gonna have to remove a lot of the interior and start tackling that area as well. If everything goes right, I think I can kind of tackle all of the rust during this next year of ownership through 2025. I don't really know what I'm gonna do for paint moving forward, so you'll have to stick around and see what the decisions are there. So that's just a quick rundown of what the car's been through for my 11 years of ownership with it. I have no plans to get rid of it. I'd like to see it through. I'd like to continue working on this car. It's been a blast so far and I'd like that to continue. Definitely make more changes moving forward with autocross and potential track days in mind. I'd like to keep up with the carbon fiber part making for the car. Kind of as I move through the rust, I'll see which sections I might be able to replace also with carbon fiber. Hint, hint, trunk, maybe rear taillight panel, but we'll see how well that goes. So there it is. That's the history of my E30. If you'd like to hear about anything in more detail, let me know and I can definitely try to respond with either comments or another video going more in depth on some of the changes that I've made over the years. And yeah, I've had this one for 11 years. I'd be curious to know any of the viewers how long you've had your E30 and what might be the longest length of ownership that somebody watching might have had. And with that, thanks for watching. I hope you stick around through 2025 to see what changes I do on my car.